back in Canada.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Nova Scotia. Yeah, the Maritimes. Yeah, I'm actually in a little fishing village. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so it's very pretty.
Yeah.
And how long was
Yeah.
your flight then?
It wasn't that bad.
No?
Just sort of
assume you had to make a
Europe,
stop.
Istanbul, so
Okay.
I'm used to it anyway. I fold up into economy shape very easily.
Yes.
So I'll do a few introductory remarks and I'll just go down here. Each one of you can do 5 minutes.
Yeah, even 3.
I was going to say 2, 3. Yeah, the questions.
Yeah.
In fact, I think we should probably begin from that end because yeah, I think that makes sense.
I haven't written mine yet.
What I'll say is I'll give you the book after 5.
Exactly.
You need those old-time stage hooks.
Yes.
Moderators.
In my introduction, I'm going to how many policies, how many activations, and then they
Everybody's quiet. Somebody wanted to just take it over here.
so you want me to do it different.
Thanks, Nana.
No, you could probably give it a few, a couple minutes.
Finished the other one like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
10 minutes ago.
And this room is not very convenient.
Well, it's the dark clouds. I hope that's not symbolic for the topic.
It is a beautiful walk to this room, though.
It is nice, that is true. I didn't realize there was that entire deck where I could have been spending some between
That's
time.
right. Yeah.
Does Steve Peter normally come to IGF? I don't remember seeing him the last couple of years.
No, he came this year just to reconnect with a few people. Yes, God, there's practically everyone here. It's amazing.
I'm sure.
I mean, he was trying to walk from one venue to another
Yeah.
and then sort of met Steve.
There are people like that. Jane is sort of like that. On the Google side, Aparna and Sarah. I don't know if you've met them.
I know Aparna, and I met Sarah briefly.
Yeah, they're sort of like that.
Yeah, those two pretend to know what they all see each other and like, oh,
Exactly, the whole Wicked Plenty Pod.
maybe
Those people.
Yes. Commiserators, fellow sufferers.
Is that a battery pack or?
Yeah, it's just it's just a freebie I got as a speaker, so it's, people underestimate the importance of speaker freebies. Huge incentive. This event in particular, it's a South African ISB Association event.
Okay, yeah.
Best stuff.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, if you geeky stuff, but
Yeah, well, the
Good
geeky
choice.
stuff is
Yeah.
the most useful.
Are you leaving tomorrow or on Friday?
Leave Friday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm on another panel tomorrow with Sonia, actually.
God bless the small panels. There's
The giant room. Yeah.
just
The small ones vary quite a bit, but yes, in general, they're smart. You can actually have a conversation.
the best one that I've been to. Actually, was the English room with Vince on Tuesday.
Yes, you mentioned that.
He just
Yeah.
savaged the industry researcher.
Yeah. I attended one where all 5 panelists each did a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation. That was not interesting. I was
actually they can share that. Yeah, we can share, right?
What?
Oh, yeah.
We'll share. That's good. Yeah. Because you have enough over there.
Yes.
That's right. We need microphone neutrality. Neutrality.
I'm going to get started here. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome to the workshop number 169, Technologies and Policies to Connect the Next 5 Billion. My name's David Reed, and if you are a weather watcher, we've got the right room for you. Looks like we might have a thunderstorm serenading us as we go through the session here. To begin, the inspiration or origins for this session was a paper, actually, that Jennifer Haroon, who's on the panel, Patrick Ryan, and I completed. And so if you want some background reading on this topic, you can Google it, and it's on the SSRN paper, and it's called Connecting Technologies and Policies for Connecting the Next 5 Billion. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. In that paper, we had a couple simple, easy to say, but difficult to research questions. Trying to answer the question, what technologies will be used and what are the most needed policies to remove deployment barriers in unserved areas of internet access. And as we went through and conducted the research, we quickly zeroed in on, given the current state of deployment of the internet on a global basis, that we zeroed in on the local access network in particular as a major remaining barrier to extending broadband to the next 5 billion individuals without the internet. And this finding was stemmed from several aspects. From a technology perspective, there was a lack of a low-cost network solution in the last mile. Bandwidth is not for free, and so trying to identify the lowest cost solution was a challenge. There's also a lack of electricity in many of the unserved areas, and that is another significant barrier. And we also identified lots of policy barriers, such as restricted access or entry into the local access market itself, often due to incumbents, difficulty to pursue infrastructure sharing in order to reduce the costs, and a lack of government leadership overall in order to move forward. So to address the uncertainties in the paper, we rolled out a concept that borrowed from the private sector, and that's road mapping. And we developed broadband roadmaps conceptually at a high level to describe the direction that we would see over the next 5 to 10 years for the deployment of additional infrastructure in the local loop. And what the broadband roadmaps allow you to do is to classify the best fit of some different last mile technology options by cost and the speed for access that you're targeting or trying to deliver. And so some insights from that exercise and developing conceptually the broadband roadmaps. Number one is that wireless was clearly the most attractive option over wireline due to lower fixed costs associated with the deployment of those networks. And so that's number one. Number two, from the core going out to the edge, you expect the gradual migration of fiber as the specific characteristics of the local conditions would permit it. So you have core being deployed more and more, you have fiber being deployed more and more in the core, and it's making its way out to the edge to a wireless type of distribution network. On the policy front, we proposed or described a 5-point policy approach to help enable the deployment of broadband roadmaps despite these challenging business conditions due to the cost situation. The first was the need for shared infrastructure, particularly with power. And an interesting aspect is that, at least looked on a time dimension of decades, there's almost a flipping that's going on in that now telecom is the driver for electricity and not vice versa. It wasn't until you don't deploy electricity and then you get telecom, but it's the need and the attractiveness of the telecom services that then spur the installation of electricity in some of these areas. Spectrum policy was another issue to the extent it depends on wireless technology. There's a need for much better spectrum management. In particular, there's a concern that a lot of the spectrum that's there is administratively occupied. That is, somebody has the license, but they just don't use it, or it's just focused in the urban areas and not in the unserved areas. And the need for more spectrum in those areas as well. A third area of policy is the access and interconnection. The role and conditions of IXPs, the Internet Exchange Points, to grow the network is a critical parameter. And another critical parameter is innovation and the stimulation for demand for broadband. Very important that you tap into the entrepreneurship, or spirit of entrepreneurship, in order to move this forward, often accomplished through liberalized markets. You need broadband app development or content that's deployed. Demand aggregation might be a key point in order to foster, in advance, try to get subscribers that are sufficient to make and justify the deployment of the network. And subsidies, like we see in the smartphones, are another important element. And finally, there's the need for collaboration. The multi-stakeholder organizations and government leadership, like the broadband roadmap or the broadband plans, with specific roadmaps are what are needed. And so in this paper, we laid out what we hope is a framework that can help spawn and identify issues to debate down the road. And in true IGF fashion, we hope that the IGF can help to identify and create its own policy plan, 5-point, 6-point, 3-point, whatever it is. But that's the contribution that helps to provide a theoretical underpinning for this session. And we're very fortunate to have just a tremendous panel here, and with a number of individuals who have literally been working on these types of issues for decades. And so the layout for the panel that we're going to be doing, each one of the panelists are going to have an opening statement from 3-4 minutes, maximum of 5, where they're going to discuss a topic of their choice, and then we'll have a set of questions to walk through associated with the issues of connecting the next 5 billion. Be happy, obviously, to interrupt at any point in time after the individual presentations with questions from the audience. So if you could be thinking about those, we certainly want audience participation. So what we're going to do is we're going to start on the far end with our first panelist talking about a particular topic of interest from their perspective. It's Salam Yamaout, who's the National ICT Strategy Coordinator for the presidency of the Council of Ministers of the Government of Lebanon. And I'm going to let folks know what the panelists, as I introduce them, what their academic pedigree is, since I'm coming from academia here. So I think it's important to point that out. So Salam has an MS in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Arizona and an MBA from École Supérieure des Affaires, which she's just saying is in Paris. So I'll let you kick us off.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I wanted to start by sharing my experience about policy making. You have to remember the people who are now doing policies in most of the world are people that have gotten a law degree 40 years ago. So technology for them is not something they understand, they like, and they're very much afraid. So the overall tendency that I found is, as soon as there's a problem, there's a tendency to over-regulate, to jump at it and protecting the citizens from the harm of everything that could happen. However, in my experience, is like you have to have policy. So every country is different than the other, and every country has a technology that is better for it in, for example, dense areas, mountain areas, desert areas, lots of poor people, lots of rich people. Every country has its own prerogatives. So good principles for policymakers is three, in my opinion. One is to allow competition, because competition is good for innovation. It's also good for reducing prices, which is an important aspect to reach the last billion people. Lower the barriers to entry, allow new ISPs to have a gaming network or some kind of other network. And the third thing is to try to attract private sector to invest in these networks. You know, in my country, they're afraid, oh, you're privatizing telecom. I mean, you're not privatizing telecom. When you privatize telecom, you don't sell a piece of land. You don't take a landmark or a piece of land and you give it to the private company. You give them a license to operate for 10 years. So really, the government has really nothing to lose from allowing somebody else to pay the money to do what they have to do. So my motto is the government should act only when markets fail, and they have 101 ways to act in putting incentives, in regulating, in paying for the stuff themselves. So the government has many, many tricks in their pocket. They have to remember that they should move only after the market fails. As far as technologies, there is one, I don't know if we're going to talk about it a bit later if you need, is the internet exchange points. Internet exchange points are a switch that is located in a country in which all local traffic is rerouted to. So if I want to send an email to somebody in my country, the traffic doesn't have to go to London and come back like it used to do before we opened the internet exchange point in Beirut. So why is it important for the technologies for the last billion? Is because by reducing this going and coming back, the capacity needed, the traffic needed, and because the IXPs are peering, so their business model doesn't have to do with the ISPs paying for that traffic, but they pay for half the circuit until they get to the internet exchange point. So it's cheaper for them to peer on the internet exchange point than to pay transit through Telecom Italia to go through Europe and come back. It's cheaper, and so this way, by putting internet exchange points in the country, you could actually reduce the cost and actually then have more people have access to the internet. And you also spur local content, because usually around the IXP, you find people coming and bringing their servers. They want to be close to the point. So first thing, the server is empty. Then the next thing, you have the most popular websites, and then you have a Akamai server or Google server, and then you have an Apple server, and the next thing you know is like you're really more self-sufficient and really saving a lot of traffic and money. So that's what I had to say.
Okay. Sonia is next. She's the Executive Director for the Alliance for the Affordable Internet. And if you didn't know, Sonia holds a master's in public policy from Tufts University and a BA and BS in economics and business finance from the University of Massachusetts. Also fluent in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. Impressive. Sonia?
Thank you, David. We just found that we alum from the same place. Thanks for giving that detail. Well, thank you. Indeed, the Alliance for Affordable Internet, for those who don't know, we are a global coalition of private, public, and civil society organizations. We work primarily in two ways, just to give you the 5-second overview. Not only through very strong advocacy at the international level for affordability to be much more prominent in the policy agendas of many different countries, as well as at the development level, but then we also work primarily in two ways. One is through direct country engagement in countries that we are already, for example, working in Nigeria, Ghana, and Mozambique. Some of you are present here. I'm very happy to see Venancio from Mozambique and Funke from Nigeria and others that we are working with as well. In those countries, we work directly by focusing on policy and regulatory reform that will lead to creating the conditions for increased affordable internet. We also support our advocacy through a very strong research program, and we publish annually a report called the Affordability Report. The new one should be coming out very soon. And I'm telling you that because not only the Alliance has come together together just about a year ago, a little over a year ago. But in the short time that we've been acting in the different regions, we've accomplished quite a bit. And one of the things that I'm very proud that we've accomplished, in addition to the work that we're already doing at the country level, has been the research that we've done to really shed more light as to how we are going to work at the policy level to address the next $5 billion that you have on the title of the panel. And so one of the findings from our affordability report was actually that of the 46 countries that we covered in our research, about 2 billion live under the poverty line, so under $2 a day of incomes. And basically for those 2 billion people in those 46 countries, the internet is very, very, very far from being affordable. There's many more. And so the challenges at the policy and regulatory level are very, very large. And that's precisely why we are working with countries directly to try to address what are some of the priority areas at the policy level that can address those problems, but really to reduce that affordability gap in the country. And so, for example, in Nigeria and in Mozambique, that we have representatives here in this room, we are working with the government for making sure that they have policies in place that will allow for infrastructure sharing to reduce the cost of internet provision and broadband access. And we are also working on spectrum policy reform, some of which we've started collaborating also with Steve in Nigeria through a workshop on spectrum policy to try to figure out what are some of the innovative ways that we can tackle spectrum policy so that not only the cost of spectrum reduces in the countries, but also so that there's more innovative uses of spectrum and more options for the current spectrum that is underutilized, as you already mentioned, and David as well. And in that way, many of the populations that now, even if they may be covered somewhat by mobile networks, and the fact is that they're actually not covered necessarily by mobile broadband networks, but so that these other options on the spectrum side can also facilitate a more affordable type of access. And that relates to issues of not only utilizing the access that is not there, but also utilizing technologies like TV white spaces, et cetera, that can provide new options for more affordable access. The other issue that I would like to just add, if I have a few more seconds, is that here we are in Turkey at the Internet Governance Forum, and many of us are privileged to have access to the Internet here or when the Internet is working, and elsewhere where we live when it's working, depending on what kind of speed and capacity we have and how much we can afford. But the reality is that for the most part in the countries that A4AI is working, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia, the percentage of the population that has access to broadband internet, it's very, very small. For the countries that we are working on, the one that has really the highest broadband penetration right now is Nigeria, and is only at about 9%. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope that we have a chance to discuss some of the different initiatives and the different policy options that are on the table to facilitate affordable access. But that's our focus. And finally, we work in all of these areas by bringing together all the different stakeholders at the national level. So our work in the countries is through national multi-stakeholder coalitions that not only define the priority issues that we support and focus on for reform, but also very much define how they would like that kind of reform to take place. So while A4AI does have as its foundation a statement of best practice policies and regulations, we very much believe that it's important to understand the realities in the context of each of the countries, so you can, starting from what we see as a best practice, but also be flexible to customize that option, that idea, that solution to the situation that a particular country may have. And I'll stop there so others can.
Thank you, Sonia. Next is Jane Coffin. She's the Director of Development Strategy at the Internet Society. And Jane, you're going to have to cough it up. What's your what's your degree in?
Classics, believe it or not.
Go ahead, tell. Not me.
Oh, sorry. Well, I am from the same alma mater as Sonia, but you would probably not believe that I'd studied Greek and Latin, archaeology, and art history. And then went on to some political, like probably Nene, some political science work. But the focus was actually things like the classics would be the books that you read about the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the other, and archaeology, this is a beautiful country for that. And so I studied in Greece and did things like that. But I joined the telecom wave about 18 years ago, and then did more work in the internet space, both overseas, living in countries working with regulators and policymakers, up front with them in their offices. So I have a lot of background in that as well, which was a good segue to the Internet Society. So I'll give you 5 seconds about the Internet Society. Like Sonia, just so that you know, many of you probably have heard of us, but we're a global nonprofit with teams around the world, and we focus at sort of the microcenter of technology policy and development. We've got a great economist on staff who's here in the room with us, Michael Kendi. He's written many reports that many of you may have seen, so we've been bringing on more of that rigor to take a look at the economic development aspects, as Sonia was suggesting, because we wanted to put data to some of the hypotheses, particularly with respect to internet exchange points. And you can see some of the data we have in a report that Michael helped put together on Nigeria and Kenya and internet exchange points, that there is economic value, there's economic development aspects to this infrastructure, which many of you know intuitively working in your countries. I'm going to focus now on IXPs in a bit more detail than Salam did, but we work very closely with colleagues around the world, and I want to stress the fact that we work with partners. We've got partners from the RIPE NCC, Mike Jensen, who's in the room here, Irakli, I'm not going to say this properly, Kashabadze from Georgia. We were just there working with him and his colleagues. We go places where people want us to go. We try not to impose ourselves. We do lots of work from a development aspect, whether it's developing internet exchange points or working with others who have developed them to level them up, take them to the next level. And I'm going to focus on 3 pieces of this: technology, the economics, and governance, very quickly. From a technical perspective, when you do build out an internet exchange point, you are creating a hub, not only a technical hub where people can come and peer. As Salam has suggested, they're not paying as much because they're usually peering free. There's some small costs like cross connects and ports, potentially for rent of a building. But you're also building a community of interest, an ecosystem. You've got the technical aspects, the routers, the switch, the cross connects, the fiber, the cables, but you also have people coming together to form a community of interest and to learn from each other. Often you can see when you're running traffic as the IXP manager or operator where other ISPs may not be running their traffic efficiently or effectively. You can communicate with them and say, hey, look, maybe we should be working on better technical throughput for your network and how to do that. We also offer training with other colleagues related to that technical throughput for traffic. But you start to build a community of engineers that become very tight with each other. That IX also is sort of more of a social home as well. We often find that the technical engineering for an IXP is easy. That's about 5% to 10% of the effort. Some say 20. I have a debate with Philip Smith about this. He says 95% social engineering, 5% technical. We could set up an IXP here in the room if we had the gear. It's that human side of bringing people together who compete with each other, who may not want to be in the same room, but then they begin to realize this is something important for the country. It's good for our development. It's good for the network development, and things progress. It's really it gives you a lot of energy when you see this happen. We've got teams in Africa who are doing great work with the African Union, over 25 best practices workshops in the last 2 years, 15 technical assistance workshops. We've moved, and Latin America has been a good benchmark as well for us. We've done lots of work there. It's a work in progress. We are not the only group that does this type of thing. As I mentioned, the regional internet registries do great work. Packet Clearinghouse does excellent work around the world. So it's a team effort. Things don't always succeed. Sometimes they fail, but from a technical perspective, you pick it back up again and see where you can build that community of interest. That's so important. I won't rest too much on the economics because that could come out of the conversation, but you do see cost savings. Ecuador is an amazing example of where they're paying $100 per megabit per second for international transit. After the IX was installed, traffic was running, $1 for local traffic, 1 megabit per second. We have this outlined in a report that we released with the support of one of our grantees in the fall of last year. It's November 2014, where are we, 13 now? 2013, on Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, and Argentina. It shows you some of the savings on cost, but also on how the traffic management was increased. They went from 400 milliseconds for traffic throughput down to 4 or 10. So there's amazing engineering, traffic engineering that is facilitated there. From a business plan perspective, and this is growing as I speak because we have colleagues in Africa who recently told me 10 years ago there was more of a volunteer spirit. It was more of a startup mentality. Now we may not see as much of the startup mentality as that you'd find in the past because people see the internet as how many apps can I design and become a millionaire versus building that core infrastructure of the IX, which is critical. And you may not, the IXP doesn't make money like a gateway might. And so some people think of it as a place where millions of dollars are going to be made. That's not the spirit of the crux of why you would put one in. But we're often seeing the cost savings from a perspective of everyone coming together. There's peering versus paying for transit. You're saving money as an operator, and your quality of service does go up there as well. From a governance perspective, this is a unique bottom-up, usually, governance model of volunteers coming together, network operators figuring out what to do. Government normally isn't involved in the top-down sort of management of an IXP. We are seeing many governments becoming very interested in internet exchange points. We're suggesting a collaborative model, so you're seeing a shift from just that volunteer spirit to perhaps we want to be on a board. CGI.BR has an excellent model that we think should be replicated in some places. Some of the regulators in Africa are asking us how they get involved. Rather than trying to do a top-down management perspective, we are promoting a leveling up of their participation where you advise them. They become part of a team to take a look at it. Salam, you probably know this well from Lebanon. And in any event, we look at the governments and often talk to them about how they can play a role in the enabling environment outside of the IX because it is an ecosystem. Where can government help facilitate, as Sonia's team has done so well to articulate, liberalization of submarine cable backhaul from the landing station? Are there middle mile issues with terrestrial fiber? Because there's a high cost still in many countries, from Lagos to Abuja. You don't send traffic overland, you send it by submarine cable now because it's too expensive. Where can we, as entities in this room and people involved in the internet community, help bring down those costs or suggest to policymakers and regulators what the value chain of effort is? And another report we put out called Lifting Barriers to Connectivity, which Michael was one of the primary authors of, points out the different places where you can push, pull, and talk to regulators and policymakers about bringing down cost in that first mile, middle mile, last mile. And I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you, Jane. Next is Steve Song, who's a researcher at the Network Startup Resource Center. Got his degree from the University of Toronto in, you didn't tell me.
What's that?
In-
No, I studied at the University of
okay.
Toronto. I didn't get a degree.
Okay, you and Bill Gates.
I want to start by talking about what I think are, well, there are three trends that inform my thinking about the future of access. My focus is particularly on Africa. So 1994 was a big year as a South African. Not only was it the first democratic elections, but also the first mobile network operator licenses were handed out in 1994 in South Africa. And that was the beginning of a revolution and in wireless access across the continent. And I don't think anyone's wildest dreams back in the mid-90s were a fraction of what has actually happened with mobile networks across the continent. However, mobile networks have become a victim of their own success to some degree, because spectrum licenses cost nothing in 1994. They were given out because there was a relative surplus of spectrum. Now, in 2014, we are in a time of apparent scarcity of spectrum. And because spectrum has become so valuable, often being auctioned for millions or sometimes billions of dollars, that has become a huge barrier to the spread of access. Both because regulators now find it very hard to find an equitable way to actually hand out spectrum, it's very difficult to run a spectrum auction that isn't being gamed by the wealthiest players in the auction. And it means that the sums of money being spent on those auctions are ultimately being passed on to the consumer. And if we're talking about connecting the next 5 billion, that's a problem. The second trend, fast forward to 2009. In early 2009, there was a single cable, 40 gigabits, a single cable connecting the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa to the internet. 5 years later, there are 10 undersea cables connecting sub-Saharan Africa. And really, that's just the tip of the iceberg, in that the arrival of those undersea cables has sparked a tsunami of terrestrial fiber buildouts. There's not a country in sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't have a national fiber backbone. If anyone wants to see this brochure from Liquid Telecom, this is just one fiber operator that runs fiber all the way from Cape Town up to the Ethiopian border. Fiber is spreading faster than anyone would have believed possible. And this is good for two reasons. Not just the obvious reason, which is fiber being the digital equivalent of a deep water port, in that you can really move serious amounts of bandwidth once you're on glass. But the second thing is that it actually changes the way you think about rollouts. The reason you had to give out a national spectrum license previously was that to be a telecom operator, you had to do the full stack. You had to build a national backbone network. You had to build the handsets and everything in between in order to roll out a network. The profusion of terrestrial fiber networks now are offering new opportunities in terms of access, in that you don't actually have to offer the full stack now. And that brings us to the third trend, which is the phenomenal success of low-cost wireless technologies. So I don't think there's a person in this room who isn't carrying a Wi-Fi device. They are not licensed. They were not designed as a rollout strategy. Wi-Fi evolved because it could. These devices, we call them mobile phones, but in the industrialized world, 75% of all smartphone data travels over Wi-Fi. We might more appropriately call them Wi-Fi phones. I mean, if we're just going to go with the biggest data carrier on the device. And there are more Wi-Fi chips shipped globally than mobile phones. It's a huge under-recognized trend, I think. And there is opportunities for that to extend into new areas with dynamic spectrum management, which is a kind of midway ground between completely unlicensed spectrum and licensed spectrum. And I'll talk more about that later. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Our next speaker is Jennifer Haroon. She's the principal in the Access Strategy and Operations at Google. She received her BS from Duke and MBA from the UC Berkeley School of Business.
Thanks, David. So I think one trend when you talk about connecting the next 5 billion that David mentioned, and actually I think all of my panelists also mentioned in some way, and the way Google thinks about it, is there really is no silver bullet in terms of connecting the next 5 billion. And that's both on the technology side and on the policy side. And in addition to the fact that there isn't one silver bullet, there's also not one organization or one constituency that can achieve connecting the next 5 billion. It really takes the work of governments, civil society, and private sector working together. And so when Google thinks about this challenge, it really tries to address this fact that it doesn't believe that there's a silver bullet. And so we work on a variety of efforts to try to test out ways that we can help advance internet access. So for instance, we look at business models that maybe haven't been tried before that we can tweak. Examples of that include Project Link, which is a wholesale metro fiber network that we built and operate in Kampala, Uganda, where we're really enabling local providers, i.e. the local mobile operators and ISPs, to take advantage of fiber built once so that each of them doesn't have to invest separately, as Steve mentioned. Or even the Google Fiber effort we have in the US, where we roll out fiber in a non-traditional way for the US, where we look at fiber hoods and where there's a lot of demand as we roll out. We also think about innovative technologies. So there are obviously the technologies that exist today, and I couldn't agree with Steve more that Wi-Fi is, I think, an underappreciated technology. But there is a possibility that there are other technologies yet to be defined that can be more efficient and more affordable in connecting more people. Examples where Google invests there is in Project Loon, where we're looking at high-altitude balloons as a way to connect people, and then also Titan Aerospace. In addition, we think about the policy issues that I think have been well mentioned on this panel already, but there in particular, it is again about working with partners. So Google is a part of A4AI, the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, and really trying to work with all of these industry and civil society players to think about ways to solve this issue. And then the last thing I wanted to touch upon that I think was not addressed yet is the capacity building aspect. So that's both capacity building in helping do the work that Jane mentioned in terms of training network engineers, but also on what I would say the demand side of internet access. So that includes investing in tech hubs and innovation hubs around the world, because it's no use to just bring the infrastructure. There then has to be the demand, the local content, and the use of the internet. And I will pause there.
Okay. Thanks, Jennifer. And last but not least, Vinay Kesari is standing in on late notice. Virat Bhatia isn't feeling up to participating today. Vinay is a lawyer specializing in ICT law and policy, works with a law firm in New Delhi, and also advises the National Internet Exchange of India. He's a graduate of Nalsar University of Law in Hyderabad.
Good evening. See, I think that considering that I'm the last speaker here and I'm replacing a very capable speaker at the last minute, I'm going to keep my comments short. See, I'd like to address two issues. One, the network infrastructure that is required to deploy new networks, and secondly, key policy issues that serve as roadblocks. Now, while addressing this, I think I will largely dwell on the Indian experience, but try to extrapolate from this to try to locate issues that have wider relevance. Now, in India, when it comes to facilitating broadband access, the major project that the Indian government has chosen to embark upon to make this happen is something called the National Optic Fiber Network, which is usually shortened to NOFIN. Now, in general, the Indian government, when it comes to telecom policy, operates on the basis of a national telecom policy, which is published every few years. The first two focused on bringing in private investment into a sector that had been a government monopoly up to that point. The second focused on building out mobile networks. The third and current policy focuses on ensuring that broadband reaches every Indian. And one of the major ways in which the government is trying to achieve this is building out a fiber backbone using public funds, which can then be used by anyone on an equal access basis. And the funds that are being used for this, I won't get into the details, but essentially we have something called the Universal Service Obligation Fund, which is basically a large pile of money that is accumulated over the years, largely from mobile carriers. And this is now being invested in building out this national optic fiber network. Now, the target of this network is essentially to make sure that about 250,000 villages in India are connected by fiber. And the idea is to lay this fiber backbone up to a certain point in each village, and then ensure that conditions are right for private service providers to provide last mile connectivity. And therefore, this is in some ways a reasonably unique project in the sense that here you have public funds being used to build out only a basic backbone and leaving last mile connectivity up to private providers almost exclusively. Now, there are a number of challenges related to this, and we need clarity on some of these before the network is built out. We're still in a fairly early stage of building this network out. Firstly, this is a classic case of a public-private partnership, and there are the case can be made that there should have been more stakeholder consultation before the project was actually implemented. The reason being that the business case for building out the last mile is still a little unclear, and this is something that is essential to the success of the project, because I think that everyone is clear in their minds that the government is only going to fund the build out of the backbone itself. It is not going to get into providing last mile connectivity through this network. And the second major issue is related to payment for the use of this fiber backbone. Will it be a pay-as-you-go model? Will it be some other type of model? Again, there haven't been extensive consultations on this, and as a result, there is a fair bit of ambiguity. So I think one lesson that can be learned from this type of experience is to make sure that you have stakeholder consultations, that happen well in advance of embarking on a major infrastructure project. I think that no one would argue that this isn't a good project. This is a great project, and I think that it can really revolutionize things in India. But there are quite a few details that need to be ironed out. What is pretty interesting about this project, I think, is that what they are trying to build here is essentially a neutral backbone, and the hope is that this will spark the creation of an ecosystem which will in many ways revolutionize the way communications happen in India. Now, the second issue that I'd like to address is the kind of policy roadblocks that can come in when you are trying to facilitate broadband access. Now, I think that one of the, and this carries on from one of the points from the earlier point about the National Optic Fiber Network. I think it's important when charting out policies to enable access to make sure that you are not preventing yourself from using the most appropriate technology in the most appropriate location. I think that, for example, fiber works well in many types of situations and many topographies, but not all. And so if you want broadband access assured to, say, 99% of your population, you need to make sure that there is a wide variety of technologies that are easily available to service providers in order to provide these services to the consumer. So satellite technology, for example, is a great way of providing internet access in remote and sparsely populated areas, and India actually has quite a few of those, especially in border areas. Now, these are areas where even laying down a publicly funded fiber backbone might not result in internet access being provided to the end user. But in India, currently providing internet access through satellite is practically impossible because of various policy challenges. We don't have an open skies policy for satellite, as a result of which it's basically commercially infeasible to provide internet access to end users through satellite. Satellite as an internet access technology is used only by niche areas like banking and the military. So I think the other thing to keep in mind is to make sure that that when you're looking at a broadband access policy, you make sure that you are not shackling yourself to a particular type of technology or a particular set of technologies, but you make a rational determination as to which is the best technology for a particular region. And I think that that's something that every developing country particularly needs to keep in mind when public funds are being used to push a certain type of technology. Thanks.
Thank you, Vinay. Okay, so question time. Question for the audience first. How many of you sat through the Policy Enabling Access, Growth, and Development on the Internet, the earlier main focus section? Can you show hands? Not very many? Some? Few? Guess not as many as I thought. I thought what was going to be the easiest question might be the most difficult for those of us who participated in that panel, since it was 3 hours long. So besides one takeaway being not to do 3-hour panels, I'm wondering if, very briefly, 30 seconds to at most a minute, if any of the panelists have a takeaway from that session that they might want to share with the audience. If not, then we'll move on, but yeah.
If I may?
Yes.
Well, to me, the takeaway, in addition to many things that were interesting that were mentioned, but the kind of disappointment, let's call it as a takeaway, is that I think many of us here, and many of us here in this room, and many of us who were in that room, were looking for more concrete examples and more concrete options and forward-looking opportunities on how we, as practitioners in this field, as people who are working with policymakers in all the different sectors, how can we make things happen? So for me, one of the things that I would like us to also discuss here and start a discussion with all of you is to not only share some of those experiences that some of you are having in your countries, in your organizations, but also look at the specifics. What does spectrum policy reform really mean in terms of what we want to see? It's, we want to see, obviously, reduction in the price of spectrum licenses, but we also want to see very concrete regulations around allowing unlicensed spectrum to be used in a way that is freely, without complications and without the fear or the threat that you may be violating some kind of regulation, or innovating with technologies that are available already, but many innovators in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America are not able to actually put in practice because policy and regulations are impediments to those opportunities. So to me, what I would like to hear and us to discuss here is who is doing what, and for those examples of where we see those things happening, can we share with each other? Spectrum is one area, taxation is another, was mentioned in the other panel, but what specific taxation, what does it mean to change taxation? Is it to lower taxation on devices? To me, that's not the only question, it's one important question, but there's taxation on infrastructure inputs, there's taxation, the kind of taxation issues that our colleagues in Nigeria face, the multi-taxation problem that has become a very convoluted process, and Minister Omobola Johnson mentioned earlier today as well. Things like universal service funds that were mentioned already by our colleague next to you, and there's many here in the room that have actually are working in that area. How do we make them more effective? How do we make universal service funds, instead of being just another opportunity for those who like to be critical, to criticize funds that are being accumulated and not being dispersed? Well, what are the steps to make them effective and really useful to subsidize not just infrastructure, but really to subsidize the kind of things that many of us raised, in terms of demand issues, content, et cetera, and even awareness, consumer awareness, campaigns, projects to make sure that those who don't have access can get to that.
You're longer than a minute now. So, any other takeaways?
So more
That's
concrete,
good answer. Very
more
good answer.
concrete examples, but there's many here that we can learn from too.
Sure. Anybody else want to add anything? No? Okay. So,
some questions on it.
Okay, we have a question here.
Yeah, my name is Osama Manzar from Digital Empowerment Foundation based in India. I just wanted to share, Sonia knows few of our story, Steve knows some of our stories. We have been working using unlicensed spectrum in India, about 10 locations, and our experience is that private sector is not interested in connecting last mile. They are not helpful at all. They don't want to give us a dedicated lease line for further distribution because they want to distribute themselves, and they didn't want to distribute themselves till the time the paying capacity is there at the last mile. And they think that we are basically taking lease line at a lower cost and distributing and making money ourselves. So they are neither giving us to further distribute it, nor they are going last mile till the time there is a paying capacity. So that is one big chunk that needs to be discussed, that we cannot connect 5 billion unless you find paying capacity the way private sector wants them to pay as an ISP or a telco. This is a hard fact on the ground that we have been experiencing. So even if you're using unlicensed spectrum, you're going, because there is a lot of last mile activity that requires to go and work with the communities, which is not like buying the connectivity out of the box. You go and buy on the shop and the rack. Here you go and knock on the door. They say, you don't know English, you don't know Hindi, you don't know what is access, but you're still interested, come here. And then there is so many things you do with them before they get connected and take advantage of it. So this is one thing that, public-private partnership or anything, it is all on the paper. They are not interested in connecting last mile. And I'm doing a very strong remark, knowing that, what we are doing on the ground. The second thing is that National Optic Fiber Network that the Government of India has given from USO fund, Universal Service Obligation, for connecting 250,000 village councils. In the last 3 years, we have not been able to reach even 600 thing. And private sector, again, is not interested. They are not part of it. They have been invited by the Government of India. I sit on the advisory committee. I know it. I have attended 5-10 meetings, and they are not interested. They are saying it's not a government job, it's our job to connect them. Why are government using our tax-paid money, which goes into USO fund, to be utilized by, again, giving connectivity to the last mile, which is our job to do?
So if I could have maybe Steve, if you could react to the unlicensed. I mean, you're saying Wi-Fi is underappreciated here. In some sense, he's wrapping the technology with the business model. How do you capitalize on Wi-Fi to address these issues like we're seeing in India here with the unlicensed and the lack of participation in the private sector? Yeah.
I think partly you just have to get out of the way. In that a lot of people assume that Wi-Fi is free to use anywhere, but the regulatory approach to unlicensed spectrum makes a huge difference. So in South Africa, there are over 100 wireless ISPs. They have a very strong industry body association that lobbies on their behalf, and there is a very, very sort of liberal policy around unlicensed use. One country north, Zimbabwe, it's possible to use Wi-Fi for a hotspot, but point-to-point licenses are unavailable. You cannot, you need a license to do it, and as the POTRA's regulator said to me directly, we don't give those out. Further north in Malawi, you can get a point-to-point Wi-Fi license, but it costs you $1,000 a year for a license, right? For a technology that costs under $100 a device, $1,000 a year license is punitive. So partly it's just getting some of the basics right around the existing Wi-Fi, and then is looking forward to new areas. So the FCC in the US have just unleashed another big chunk of 5 gigahertz spectrum for Wi-Fi use, and this is tremendous broadband potential. So looking at the 5 gigahertz range for expanding Wi-Fi, and then I'll talk about it a bit later, but looking at dynamic approaches to spectrum management.
I saw a couple hands who were...
If I could just respond.
Oh boy, we got a lot of hands. Okay, very quickly.
Just to respond to the point about the USOF and NOFN in India, I think that, as I had mentioned, it could definitely be argued that there should have been more stakeholder consultation before the project was rolled out. I think, though, that getting the private sector on board is a function of just making sure that you present the right kind of business cases to them and make sure that they figure out the right business cases. For example, NOFN can be used for mobile backhaul. which is a huge requirement in India. And as data usage in particular grows in India, the fact is that even even service providers who already have existing backbone networks will need more bandwidth. And rather than invest in building more fiber or building new networks themselves, they could actually use NOFN to provide mobile backhaul on existing networks.
So where is the microphone? Whoever's closest to the microphone to start with here.
Sure. Yeah.
Quick, we got a lot of questions.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
yeah.
Just to add some perspective, and I'm in Nigeria and operating, and I heard what you said in India, and it's not very different. But in most of these developing markets where we have people who are unconnected, the reality of giving access and the economics are really based on the local macroeconomic conditions. So you can give free Wi-Fi, but you have to backhaul the traffic to connect to anything, and someone has built that network with some debt that they haven't fully recovered, and so they're blocking it. And I think part of what you have in most developing parts of the world is the regulatory systems are not that sophisticated as in the advanced economies where these things work. Rule of law is not quite the same. Indicators of risk in doing business are different. And so really where solutions are technically feasible without resolving those local ecosystem issues, you don't get the kind of rollout or development that you really require. I mean, we built a submarine cable, and our biggest challenge for years is we can't feel the impact. Not because the expectations in terms of this was a critical missing component, and this did not exist. So once we bring this in, everyone who has latent demand to the internet is going to be able to get it. And then you find that retail operator that's built their network for mobile voice is not prepared to put the electronics on to facilitate data, because the profitability of data is different from the business case they built, and it just cascades down the line. So I think Sonia asked a really great question in terms of what does it really take? I think each market really needs to sit and look at it. But some of the global policies from more advanced societies just don't recognize the challenges. And no matter how many billions, I hate to say, are put at it, it just doesn't get through to the people who we're trying to connect.
Okay, if you could, behind you, we're going to work back a little bit. Is there any reaction from anybody on the panelists to that comment? Yep, Jane?
Often we see that you need a champion, one or two people to push an IXP from a technical perspective and get the social engineering right. You often need that with regulators as well. I mean, you need a champion in government to push. And if it's not the regulatory body, often you can, if it's one of us as a partner coming in to talk to a prime minister's office or the president's office. We saw that happen in Romania when the prime minister's office said, this is important, it's going to happen, rollouts took place, licenses were more available.
I'm going to try to move through all these questions as fast as I can back here with the microphone.
Hello. Yes, I'm Tonyo from the Philippines. I'm a blogger. What do you think would be the role of the state or the government? We're talking using the language of markets and companies. Do you see any role for states or governments specifically in establishing broadband networks? Are this important? That's number one. Number two, what would be the role of fighting monopolies and trusts? Because those are concerns in developing countries. We feel that the absence of regulations for against monopolies and trusts do not serve common interests like rolling out broadband access.
Okay, so somebody want to respond to that question? And you could help me back here. Yes.
Maybe you can take several?
Yeah, there's so many questions.
Well, we won't get to them.
That's okay. Let's take some more, and then we'll group a bunch together.
Some more.
Hi, I'm Michael Kendi. I'm a colleague of Jane's at the Internet Society. Just kind of shifting gears, we put out recently a report, the Global Internet Report, that's available on our website. And one thing that I found one group, I think the World Internet Project, had done surveys of non-internet users, asking them why they weren't on the internet. And there were about 20 countries, and I would say they're basically upper and middle income, no lower income countries. And the questions basically divided into, why aren't you on the internet? And one set of responses was basically, I'm not interested, or I don't understand it, and the other was, I can't afford it, or I don't have access. And in every one of the countries, the majority was not interested, not that they couldn't afford it. So, in many countries have 3G networks throughout the country and much higher penetration or coverage than people taking the access. So I wonder if we're also should be looking at getting people interested, getting them the content that will get them online, similar to the type of content that we look at in our, some of us have available in our home countries about our home government, our home cities, and the things that interest us may just not be available and may not bring people online who could afford it and who do have access.
Okay. Do we have other people wanting?
Hi, Mark Summer from Rollo Broadband in San Francisco. We help service providers in emerging markets get into the market, mostly focused on enabling Wi-Fi unlicensed type technologies. And I'm actually pretty excited. I think it's a pretty interesting time right now because we have so much cables coming into sub-Saharan Africa especially, but as well in Asia. And we're starting to see more and more of that middle mile fiber come to villages and secondary towns and so forth. I think the key is to be able to access that in a sustainable way for a service provider. For example, in Tanzania, it really doesn't make sense to access the fiber unless you're buying 150 megabits at a time or more, because the economics are just bad when you buy less. But that's a huge chunk for a small population potentially for a service provider to start. So those are the kind of things where I think there's a lot of enablement can be done with the right regulatory environment or the right economic enabling framework of networks like the one in India the gentleman mentioned.
Okay.
And we see when that happens, we can build service providers who provide an alternative access at a really interesting economics to their populations.
Okay, if we could bring, there's a couple of folks up front here who want to.
Yeah. Marco Honing, Brightpens here, pretty much with the previous speakers, and I don't believe wireless alone is enough. You need backhaul, and for backhaul you need some fiber infrastructure that's accessible, which basically means that if there's only one party supplying it, it won't work. You need a working market. And the question to the panel, and this was brought up in a session this morning that was supposed to go on net neutrality, is you either build that infrastructure yourself, which means you have really deep pockets, which means that if you build it, you're going to keep it to yourself. The other alternative is have the government subsidize it, have the government incentivize, build it. And to hook up to what Salam says was, government should step in when market failure. We can say it's market failure, government steps in. What was brought up the panel this morning was, but that's government stepping up is actually disrupting the market, and in that sense creating market failure. So I was wondering what the panelists think about that particular dilemma. Should you wait for the market or should you be disruptive?
Okay, but maybe we've had three. Can we have the panel just respond to a couple of this before we? Here's Jennifer. Or, we haven't heard from you, Jennifer. You haven't?
Oh, you want to go? Maybe I'll comment on the last question, and also I think related to Mark's comment. Like I said earlier, I think there are a lot of constituencies that need to come together, and in particular, talking about backhauling. What we did with Project Link in Kampala did decide to build a fiber network. When we looked at the issues, particularly in Kampala, they have access to undersea cables. There's a wonderfully competitive last mile with multiple mobile operators and ISPs operating. But what was missing was that high quality, basically unlimited capacity backhaul. Most providers were using microwave, which I think most people in here know has capacity constraints. And one of the ways we thought about this issue of competition is that we run a network that's open to all of the local providers as long as they're licensed. We also have a flat rate card. So we call it in our team the bar test. So if all of our customers entered a bar, showed each other their rate cards from us, it would be the same. There wouldn't be any surprises. The other thing that we really wanted to encourage was usage. And it's a little bit funny to me that the industry really charges everything by the bit. That's how all of us pay our cell phone bills. And instead, we offer our local provider customers unlimited capacity, and it's instead based on a monthly fee. Because as I think we all know, fiber capacity doesn't cost more when you use the next bit. At some level, maybe you have to upgrade the equipment a little bit, but it really isn't a per bit cost. And so those are some of the business model changes that we are trying with Project Link. So I don't think that it's just a choice between government or one player. In our case, we have a license from the government of Uganda, but it is not an exclusive license, so someone else could come in and compete with us with a very similar model.
So, thanks, Jennifer. We have Salam, and then we'll go I think right here. You had right there, then back behind you. You've been waiting too. Okay.
I wanted to answer to the question of the role of the state, monopoly and trust. Telecom is a commodity, is a public commodity. That's why it is regulated. Unlike bread or water or when you buy clothes, the government does not regulate the people who sell you jeans. However, the governments all around the world have decided to regulate the telecom business because it's a public commodity. So that's the role of the government could happen at many stages. The first one, they have to, if they have a vision especially, they can give incentives. The government of Australia built a network, a core fiber network to go into the desert because businesses did not go there. Other countries control the number of licenses to decide how many players can compete against each other. And thirdly, also governments have given incentives to help companies go to the areas where there is no business case, like the gentleman from India is talking about. So the government has a lot to play, and that, as Marco said, do they, how aggressive they are, how laid back they are. We see around the world different models, but at the end of the day, the government plays a role in not allowing that telecom market to become a monopoly and to keep some trust and some quality of service with the people. And they have a lot of tools to regulate that market and do stuff work.
Okay. Thanks, Salam. Okay, let's go.
Hi, Aral Balkan from INDI, the Independent Technology Initiative. I have a question for Salam and Jennifer. It's the same question, actually, just different aspects of it. Salam, you mentioned that we need to lower the barrier of entry and attract private sector into to build things, and that government should only get in when markets fail. I guess my question is regarding what we consider a market failure, because as I see it, if we take it to its logical conclusion, we're going to end up with only private digital spaces. Private spaces in which we can, we communicate, we share things, we engage in things that we think are necessary to democracy, but they're going to be only private. So would the lack of public digital spaces be considered a market failure in your model? And part of the reason I ask this is Jennifer mentioned that Google are now providing connectivity in the form of Google Fiber, for example, and Google Loon for the next 5 billion. And what wasn't mentioned is that to use Google Fiber, you need to use your Google account, your one Google account, the same Google account you use for Gmail, the same Google account you use for Picasa, for all of the other Google properties. So at that point, it's not just connectivity, it is a certain type of connectivity that comes attached to your Google account. So I would love to know if, Jennifer, you see any elements of, I guess, what I could possibly only call a new type of colonialism where we're kind of going, we're going to connect you to the internet with Google Loon, but here are the rules that are attached to it. It's a Google connection. Because we've seen Facebook do this with internet.org. They provide a subset of the internet as a free internet connection, but it's for accessing Facebook, actually. And both of those initiatives are going to a group of other people who are the other and saying, here we go, we're bringing you the fire. Here's the white man bringing you the fire. So what are your thoughts on those aspects?
So we're going to get a couple more questions from the audience, and we'll circle back. And Jennifer, you have some time to think about that. Right behind you, you don't, yeah, right, yeah, right here. Yep.
Mr. Chairperson, my name is Venancio Masinge, and I'm building from what you asked some times ago. You asked the takeaway. I really want to take away something. Because a part of me recognizing the quality of our speakers, also I was very much interested in knowing what technologies and policies to connect the next 5 billion.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I am not sure if I'm taking away something still on that. My suggestion is probably in the future, maybe today is not possible, will be interesting to subjects like these ones. We discuss what are the strategies to cover the 5 billion. We also will have a sort of indicators to cover the 5 billion. Okay. Assuming that we will not have more babies, so we will not have more billions.
Okay.
And then I think we also will have a sort of success stories from which we could build, taking into account what was said. So I think from one of this meeting to the next one, maybe this institution could work out based on their program some results that can be shared, both in terms of strategy and indicators that can help to resolve this issue. Mr. Chairperson, it's almost 20 years now. I am discussing the issue of last mile. This we're discussing here.
Okay.
And I think it will be good we have some outcome. Thank you.
Okay. Now we need to get some folks over here as well. We'll come back. So you got a...
Right. Hi, Manu Sporni. I'm the chairman of the Web Payments Community Group at the World Wide Web Consortium. I know the discussion today is around technology and policies for connecting the next 5 billion people. And the reason that we're talking about that is we believe that if we connect those next 5 billion people, there are going to be some really positive outcomes for them. But the discussion today has really focused on the exact building out the hardware, kind of the networks and whatnot. And we haven't really focused on applications. What are technology and policy decisions we should make around applications that those next 5 billion should get? So for example, should the internet have a core way of doing payments, a way for the world's unbanked, the people that financial institutions aren't really interested in building their networks out to? Should we create a mechanism for people to store and send money to each other built into the core architecture of the internet? Should we have an identity-based mechanism built into the core architecture of the internet so that governments that have a hard time building identity mechanisms out to their population have this capability of just reusing a good privacy protecting identity mechanism that we've built into the web. So these are problems that we're actually working on at the World Wide Web Consortium, but I haven't really heard them discussed as technology and policy discussions that we should be having. So I think there are two layers to the discussion here. One of them is how do we get last mile stuff done, how do we build out the networks, and then what applications, technology and policy discussions should we have around the applications that we're going to deploy? Because this isn't the first time this isn't the first time we're pushing the internet out to people. We have experience in building the internet out to people. Now let's learn from the mistakes that we've made over the last 15 years and figure out how we can do it better this time around.
So, I'll let Jennifer respond, and then Steve, and then Sonia. In response to the one question, I will ask each one of the panelists for their one-sentence takeaway that they'd like the audience to take away from the session today at the very end as the last question. And it won't be as comprehensive as you've asked, but it's a good suggestion for the very end. So Jennifer, and then Steve, and then Sonia.
So there's sort of three responses that I want to give that are related. When it comes to the innovative technologies we're developing, there we're really focusing on developing the technology and seeing if it will work. So that we have yet to think about the potential business models for using those technologies. In the terms of Project Link in Kampala, we are serving the end user, we are not serving the end users, we're serving the last mile players who are then bringing internet to the end users. So there's no restrictions on using our connections. It's really up to the last mile players and their end user customers. And then related to that is we really believe that the ISP's role is to connect the end user, and then it's the end user's decision what they want to do on the internet. And that's true in the case of Google Fiber. So our customers connect Google Fiber, and then they can connect to anywhere on the internet. There are no restrictions.
One of my frustrations at the IGF is that all of the conversations start at a very narrow place and then span out to embrace almost everything. So I want to suggest, while I'm so tempted to respond on the zero rating issue on internet.org, after the 5 sessions we've had in net neutrality, we're just going to leave that one out for the time being. And I mean, what you're talking about with web payments is layer 5 and 6 on the internet. The internet is made of 7 layers, right? And so far, in all of the discussions we've had to date, we have never dipped below layer 3. Right? TCP/IP, layer 3 and 4, we're very concerned about net neutrality, but we don't talk about the importance of the actual access layer of the internet, and there's no incentive, right? There's tons of incentives for digital entrepreneurs and to build digital applications, but comparatively. But when we talk about access entrepreneurs, they're locked out. They're locked out because of spectrum policy. The opportunity to innovate in this space is huge, but we need to unlock that, both in terms of unlocking regulation and unlocking investment, angel investment in all kinds of access layer startups. It's the unloved child of the 7 layers.
Tanya?
Okay, there's so many things, it's hard to focus, but just a few points. First of all, on the issue of competition that many of you mentioned, let me put the plug. Check our affordability report online, which does have a lot of answers to some of your questions. But just briefly, competition is definitely not the silver bullet. It's important, it's necessary, but governments do have a role in interfering in the market when the market fails, as Salam was saying. And there's good ways of doing that while you're promoting development, while you're promoting innovation. And there's many best practices on how to do that. That will be a whole nother section, how to do that. And we do a lot of work with the countries that we are engaging with in that area. The other thing, just as a reality check, we're talking about internet access, we're talking about mobile broadband, and I was just looking at some numbers that I happen to have in front of me because of something recent. And just to give you a few examples, when we're talking about broadband access, and this is why access for us and affordability remains the most critical issue to tackle. You look at countries like Indonesia that in the standard kind of indicators has 121 penetration of mobiles. Well, only 24% of those mobile subscriptions are actually 3G. This is according to the GSMA. So if you think about the ability of using broadband and internet, even on the mobile, It's very small in the very large spectrum of access in a country like Indonesia. The same thing is true in India, where 70% penetration of mobile, only 7% of all subscriptions are 3G subscriptions, okay? And it goes on and on like that on most developing countries, which are the ones that we work on and we try to have an impact. So the questions, the real priority questions from a policy and regulatory perspective in these countries are very basic. And to me, the takeaway is that they're basically important, but they need to be answered now, because it's not just about the 2 billion that live under the poverty line, but the 1 or 2 billion that live just above and still cannot afford, even if they have a mobile connection, because the prices are still so high. And there's just it makes no sense that policy or regulation are not doing the right thing to change that. So to me, the takeaway is that we need to work together, all the stakeholders, just as we are doing in many of the countries that IFRI is working. But many of you here, that's where the real impact lies. So that instead of having 24% 3G connections in Indonesia or 7 in India or 1 in Nigeria, we have many more of those mobile users to adopt internet and to adopt broadband access much more easily and affordably.
Okay, we got 2 questions with the mics here. You guys.
Mike Jensen, Association for Progressive Communications, APC. I just wanted to focus in again on the role of state in operating networks. We seem to see a range of models from complete inactivity in that area through to competing with the private sector, such as in Brazil and Australia, through to monopoly government networks. And I wondered if the panel might have any views on those 3 different models, given the history of the inability of the state to actually operate these networks effectively. But then to zero down on the role of municipalities as well. We hear quite a lot about municipal backbones and municipal networks as metropolitan area networks, and I wonder if the panel has any reactions to the effectiveness of the city-based backbone networks, and perhaps in particular what the role is of, for example, is Google stepping in Kampala because the Kampala municipality wasn't able to do this, or is a municipal fiber optic backbone not a good idea? Thank you.
Turhan Muluk, Intel. I think we also need to consider digital literacy. We are talking about to increase the connectivity. Everybody can use the mobile phones, but the people cannot use without digital literacy the smartphones or the computers. Therefore, it's very important to develop the digital literacy program. Also, usage of ICT in education. Thank you.
Okay. Any reactions, Pam? Yep.
I'd like to respond to the gentleman from APC. I think the ideal role for the government should be to design a regulatory system with the right set of incentives and the right commercial imperatives, and then let the private sector develop the right kind of solution. Unfortunately, that works only in a perfect system, and many countries around the world do not have that type of perfect market. And therefore, I think that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It really is something that needs to be customized to the history and the economic realities and the political system of every country. And we can draw from best practices of countries that have faced similar challenges. But, for example, to compare, the challenges to providing broadband access in India to, say, the US as it is today is really comparing apples and oranges. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution, although the ideal is one where the government plays a very hands-off role.
As an observer of African markets for a number of years, particularly South Africa, I can say with confidence that it's a very dangerous thing to hand your network over to the government exclusively. In terms of regulatory policies, I just want to echo my colleague here in saying that there's no recipe book, right? There's no one, each market is individual, and the way, it's a bit like raising children, if someone showed me the rule book on raising children, I'd like to see it, because they're all different and complex, and you need to take what you can learn from other networks and then apply them uniquely, because there are lots of markets. Kenya, for instance, by rights should not be a competitive market. The dominant operator, Safaricom, has 75% of the market, yet it has the cheapest prices certainly in East Africa, but I think in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not just the number of competitors. If I had to pick one thing out, though, that really sort of strikes me about where I see change happen, it's leadership. So, where you see strong leaders, in Kenya, Batenge and Demo, in Nigeria recently, Oluma Johnson, and also industry leaders as well, who basically show the way of how the market can evolve. And finally, just on municipal strategies, yes, I think municipalities are increasingly seeing themselves as economic entities that need to develop progressive strategies to attract businesses and to grow. And clearly, fiber is just like an essential part of that.
Oh, well, my takeaway is that it's not an either-or solution. We can have many kinds of network, private networks, public networks. The governments could be running and operating school network, hospitals network, municipalities could run city networks, and private sector could run other networks. So I think the takeaway is there is a space for everybody, and there is a solution depending on, as you said, as the vision that you want to achieve. The solution exists, it's the political way. Finish.
I thought I had already done my takeaways, but if you give me an extra minute, I'll say we would love to hear from you at A4AI. We are doing really interesting work, and so if you want to learn more, go to a4ai.org. Learn about it, and join us so that you can also be part of the process of having an impact at the policy and regulatory level, not just within the countries that we work, through the research that we do, but also at the international level, advocating for the right messages for affordability. So thank you.
I would say build your roadmaps and the community. You really need those communities of interest to facilitate discussion so that your champions emerge, and work on the regulator becoming a business development entity so that you can move forward through that mechanism.
Healthy markets nurture small players to grow up to challenge big players. This is something that is signally missing in the wireless markets. So we need, regulatory and policy change to enable small access entrepreneurs.
At risk of repeating myself and my fellow panelists, I think I'm going to say what I said from the beginning, which is that there is no silver bullet. And as Steve said, there's no one answer for every country, every municipality. And so listening to your constituents, engaging everyone in the process, and looking at examples, but then tweaking those examples to fit your situation is really key.
If you're designing a national broadband plan or a policy for the entire country, I would say that try to make sure that it is technology agnostic as far as possible, so that people are able to use the technology that best fits the problem in a particular region and in a particular terrain, and make sure that if public money is being invested in a particular type of technology, the policy environment does not unduly favor that particular technology to the exclusion of other technologies.
So, and my takeaway, having listened to the comments in the audience and on the panel from folks who are far smarter on this topic than I am, is there is some controversy around the local access and what's going on. You know, folks saying, hey, it's just completely broken, to others saying, well, it's kind of working here. So I think for the IGF, maybe that's something they can take note to try to move forward a path to fix it where it's not working. So with that, I'd like to thank the audience for fantastic participation here, and I'd like to thank the panel for their participation. Thank you.